You don't need a $12 spray. You don't need batteries, refills, or anything plugged into a wall. And you definitely don't need to coat your skin in chemicals just to sit outside for a few hours. There is a much simpler way, one that costs almost nothing, uses materials you can find at any hardware store, and keeps working long after every store-bought solution runs out. It sounds impossible at first. 2 pieces of metal, a bit of damp soil, one simple connection. That's it. No moving parts, no hidden components. And yet, under the right conditions, this setup can change the environment around you in ways most people never even consider, not by overpowering nature, but by quietly working with it. This isn't a trend or a viral hack. It's based on a principle that has existed for centuries, tested, observed, and then slowly forgotten. And the strange part is not that it works in certain ways. The strange part is how completely it disappeared from everyday knowledge. So if something this simple has been known for so long, why isn't it common knowledge today? Why aren't outdoor guides, camping manuals, or even basic survival courses teaching it as a standard technique? Instead, we're told to rely on products that last a few hours, wear off quickly, and need to be replaced over and over again. The answer isn't as dramatic as a conspiracy, but it isn't entirely accidental either. Over time, knowledge that can't be packaged, branded, or sold repeatedly tends to fade into the background. Not because it has no value, but because it doesn't fit into a system built around constant consumption. And when something disappears quietly like that, it creates a gap filled by convenience, marketing, and habit. What you're about to see isn't a miracle solution, but it may change the way you think about problems you assumed always required something store-bought to fix. Long before shelves were filled with repellents and packaged solutions, people didn't have the option to buy their way out of discomfort. If insects became a problem, they couldn't drive to a store or order something overnight. They had to observe, adapt, and work with what was already around them. They paid attention to the ground they stood on, the water nearby, the materials they could gather, and the patterns that repeated over time. Survival wasn't about convenience. It was about understanding. Small changes in environment often made the biggest difference. And those changes didn't come from complex tools, but from simple awareness. Over generations, that awareness turned into quiet knowledge, practical, unspoken, passed down through use, rather than explanation. But as life became easier and more dependent on manufactured solutions, much of that understanding was set aside. Not because it stopped working, but because it was no longer necessary to remember. What was once common sense slowly became something unfamiliar, even strange to modern thinking. At the center of this idea is a simple physical reality. When 2 different metals are placed into moist soil, a small electrical potential is created. The soil acts as a natural electrolyte, allowing ions to move between the metals. One metal gives up electrons more easily, the other receives them, and that difference creates a measurable voltage. It's the same fundamental principle behind a battery, just without a manufactured casing. The effect is not strong, and it doesn't behave like a power source you would use for devices, but it is real. That subtle flow of energy interacts with the surrounding environment in ways that are still not fully explored in everyday applications. What matters here is not the strength of the output, but the fact that it exists at all, quiet, constant, and powered entirely by the natural conditions already present beneath your feet. Centuries ago, long before modern electronics were fully understood, early experimenters began noticing that the ground itself could produce small amounts of electricity under the right conditions. In the mid-18th century, European researchers were already exploring how electrical forces interacted with soil, plants, and living systems. By the early 1800s, practical demonstrations had taken shape. One of the most well-known examples came from a Scottish inventor who buried 2 different metals in damp earth and was able to generate enough current to power a simple clock for extended periods. It wasn't powerful, but it was consistent, and that consistency was enough to prove that the concept worked. Over time, variations of this setup appeared in agricultural experiments across parts of Europe, where researchers explored how subtle electrical differences in soil might influence plant growth and surrounding conditions. These observations were documented, discussed, and even presented in formal settings. But as technology advanced and industrial solutions became dominant, Interest in these low-cost, low-output systems began to fade. They weren't efficient for large-scale power, and they didn't offer immediate commercial value. Gradually, what had once been an area of curiosity became a historical footnote, preserved in records but rarely revisited in practical use. Alongside those early experiments, something else began to surface: small, inconsistent but intriguing observations about changes in the environment around these setups. In some cases, researchers noted that soil conditions seemed slightly different near the electrodes. In others, there were subtle shifts in how insects behaved in the immediate area. Not dramatic changes, not controlled results, but enough to raise questions. Some reports mentioned fewer insects gathering near certain treated zones, while others described altered activity patterns rather than complete absence. These details were never the primary focus of the experiments, which is why they were rarely studied in depth. Still, they persisted in scattered notes and observations, suggesting that even weak electrical interactions in natural environments might influence more than just plant growth. Whether these effects were direct or indirect was never fully determined, but they added another layer to an already unusual phenomenon, one that seemed simple on the surface, yet more complex the closer it was examined. To understand what actually holds up under modern science, it's important to focus on what has been consistently verified. Mosquitoes and many other biting insects depend on water to reproduce. They lay eggs in standing water, and those eggs develop into larvae that remain there until they mature. This stage of the life cycle is extremely sensitive to environmental conditions, including the presence of certain metals. Copper, in particular, has been studied for its ability to affect mosquito larvae at low concentrations. When small amounts of copper are present in water, it can disrupt biological processes in the larvae, reducing survival rates over time. This doesn't happen instantly, and it doesn't repel adult insects in the air, but it does target the source of the problem. By limiting where insects can successfully reproduce, you reduce their numbers before they ever become a nuisance. This is not a theory or historical anecdote. It is a well-documented interaction that has been observed across multiple controlled studies and practical applications. At this point, it's important to draw a clear line between what is supported by evidence and what is often exaggerated. There is no invisible barrier extending 20 feet in every direction, and there is no setup that instantly drives away every flying insect. Those claims are not grounded in reliable data. What does exist is a combination of small, real effects that influence the environment over time. Subtle electrical activity in soil, the presence of metals, and changes in water conditions can all play a role, but they do not act like a switch that turns insects off. Understanding this difference matters. It keeps expectations realistic and prevents disappointment. More importantly, it shifts the focus away from quick fixes and toward a more grounded approach, one that works gradually, quietly, and in alignment with how natural systems actually behave. If you want to put this into practice, the process is straightforward and doesn't require precision tools or technical expertise. You start with two different metals, commonly copper and galvanized steel, and place them into damp soil a short distance apart. The key factor is moisture, because without it, the soil cannot function as an effective medium for ion movement. Once both metals are in the ground, you connect them with a simple wire, allowing the natural electrical potential to form. This alone won't transform your environment, but it becomes part of a larger approach. The real impact comes from combining this setup with control over water sources. Any standing water nearby should be minimized, and if that's not possible, introducing small amounts of copper into those areas can help disrupt mosquito development over time. Positioning a few of these metal pairs around your immediate space, such as near where you sleep, cook, or rest, can subtly influence conditions in those zones. It's not about creating a force field. It's about stacking small, natural advantages that work together gradually, reducing the factors that allow insects to thrive in the first place. What makes this approach meaningful isn't just the outcome, but the mindset behind it. Instead of reacting to problems with something external and temporary, you begin to understand the systems that create those problems in the first place. You stop asking what product can solve it, and start asking what conditions allow it to exist. That shift changes everything. It moves you away from dependency and toward awareness. The solution becomes less about control and more about alignment, working with natural processes instead of constantly trying to override them. And in a world built around convenience, that kind of thinking is easy to overlook. But once you see it, it's difficult to ignore, because it applies far beyond a single problem. For many people, this isn't just about insects or camping comfort. It's about having an option when resources are limited. It's about a parent trying to protect their family without spending money they don't have, or someone living far from stores where simple products aren't always accessible. In those moments, knowledge becomes more valuable than anything you can buy. A piece of wire, a bit of metal, and an understanding of how your environment works can mean the difference between constant frustration and quiet control. There's something deeply human in that, being able to rely on what's around you, instead of always reaching for something outside of it. It's not about replacing everything modern. It's about remembering you're not powerless without it. So what you're really taking away here isn't a miracle device or a hidden trick that solves everything instantly. It's a different way of looking at problems that most people assume require a product to fix. You've seen how simple materials, basic principles, and a bit of awareness can shift the environment in subtle but meaningful ways. And once you understand that, you start to notice how many solutions have been overlooked simply because they weren't packaged and sold. If this perspective gave you something new to think about, share it with someone who still believes every problem has to come from a store. Because sometimes, the most useful knowledge isn't what's advertised the most. It's what quietly remains available to anyone willing to pay attention.